7 works ascribed to the famous 7th century Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti. Until recently, all we had of the Sanskrit original text of this work amounted to a few fragments. Otherwise, we had to rely on its Tibetan translation. And there were several attempts, I'm sorry that it's too small a screen, there were several attempts to translate the whole work from the Tibetan, as there were attempts to reconstruct the Sanskrit original text from the Tibetan. But these attempts, however brave and interesting in their own right, were inevitably speculative and problematic in a number of ways. Then, in 2011, Junjie Su published an article on Sanskrit fragments of the Sampanantara Siddhi that he had extracted from an anonymous Sanskrit commentary on this book. And then Ernst Steinkeller got access to photographs of a manuscript that was long preserved at the Drepung Monastery in Tibet, and that contains the Sanskrit text of several important works, including the Sampanantara Siddhi. This enabled Vincent Chinga and myself to prepare a diplomatic and a critical edition of the Sanskrit text, along with a translation and analysis of it and a Tibetan edition. This is basically a work that is completed. We are quite literally about to send it to the publisher. Now, as to this unique Sanskrit manuscript, it is quite faulty, and many of its folios are perfectly legible, quite legible, but some of them are badly damaged. So we had to use additional sources in order to produce the critical edition. These sources include, of course, first and foremost, Tibetan translation, but also commentaries. Vinita Deva's commentary, or rather, its Tibetan translation, because we did not have access to the Sanskrit original text, although there are indications that it might still be extant somewhere in China. And there is also a very late commentary that was composed directly in Tibetan. Sherbatskoy and Kitagawa, who both translated the work from the Tibetan, use these two commentaries. But on top of these, we also have recourse to the anonymous Sanskrit commentary that was the basis of Chu's article. I said it was anonymous simply because we have neither the beginning nor the end of the manuscript, so we have no clue as to its author's name. And it is very fragmentary. But what's left of it is of great interest because it engages in philosophical discussions far more than Vinita Deva's often plain word-to-word glossary. And then we also considered other sources because this work was discussed after Dharmakirti. So there are a few quotations and paraphrases scattered in Buddhist and Jaina works. And most of all, this is a work that is discussed at length in Shaiva sources. Because Utpaladeva, in particular, was an important 10th century Shaiva philosopher, and his famous commentator Abhinava both had much to say on the Sampanantara in thus far unpublished part of the Igorapata Bibliography, Utpaladeva quotes at least 3 Sampanantara sutras in full, and Abhinava, besides quoting the preliminary stanza of the work, as many other authors, provides detailed glosses for a number of additional sutras. And both Shaiva authors discuss in detail some key arguments in the Sampanantara Siddhi and how they were understood in their time. So we got a lot of Shaiva help in our attempts to understand this Buddhist book. Now, as to its content, it is entitled The Demonstration Siddhi of Other Sampanas series or cognitive theories. It is about cognitive theories because, of course, the Buddhists deny that consciousness has a substantial unity. They rather view consciousness as a series of cognitive events that have no duration and that are all different from each other. But so why should we demonstrate other cognitive theories and what sense? Well, this is a work that is conspicuously written from the point of view of a Buddhist idealist who believes that the entire phenomenal world does not exist beyond consciousness, because this phenomenal world is nothing but internal forms, internal appearances taken on by consciousness, just as when we're dreaming. And the entire work defends this idealism against the criticism of other Buddhists who believe in the reality of external objects. They are Dr.Bhawani. And these externalists are identified explicitly by several of our sources as Sautrans. Now, these externalists argue that idealism inevitably leads to solipsism. Because if we accept idealism, then all the objects that we perceive have to be just as unsubstantial as the things that we see in our dreams. But this also has to be true of the people whom we perceive. They have to be nothing but internal appearances within our own cognitive theory. And it is quite a problem for Buddhists to deny the reality of other people, if only because compassion is a cardinal virtue of Buddhism. But how do you practice compassion if there's no one to be compassionate about? Interestingly, Dharmakirti has a rather roundabout way of answering this objection, because in response to it, he points out that, in fact, when it comes to knowing other people, the externalists, contrary to what they think, are not in a better position than the idealists. Because even the externalists have to admit that we never actually perceive other people. So of course, we can see, touch their bodies, we can hear their voices and so on. But we cannot perceive other people themselves, because what makes them people, rather than their things, is the fact that they are conscious. And consciousness is just not something that you can see or touch. So we are all aware that there are other people around us, sometimes painfully so, as when we live in a small hot room. But this awareness, in fact, is not a perception. It stems from a kind of reasoning, an inference, which basically goes like this. Whenever we move or speak, we can observe directly within ourselves that our movement or speech is preceded in us by a conscious will, an intention, samiha, to move or to speak. And so, when we witness outside our own body a bodily movement or speech that wasn't intended by us, we can infer that it was caused by an intention that is ours. And since an intention is a cognitive event, this means that there are other minds. So our awareness that there are other minds is really based on the direct observation that we can have in ourselves of the vyakti, of the invariable concomitant between the intention to move or to speak and the resulting action. This reasoning was not invented by Dharmakirti. It was put forward by various externalists long beforehand, including non-Buddhist ones. There is a version of this instance of other minds in early Nyaya, as there is in early Mimamsa. So all Dharmakirti does is he takes this instance of other minds, which is accepted by externalists of all stripes, and he shows that it remains perfectly valid if we transpose it in an idealistic conceptual frame. Because if we embrace idealism, well, of course we no longer believe that bodily movements or speeches really occur in the external world. But the phenomena, the appearances of bodily movements or speech are still perfectly real as internal appearances within our own cognitive theories. And so we can still draw the inference on the basis of this directly observed vyakti between the phenomenon of intention and the phenomenon of the resulting action. So The goal of the Santana University is to show that idealism entails no solipsism in a very specific sense. That is, in the sense that idealism remains perfectly capable of accounting for our everyday awareness that there are other people around us. But while Dharmakirti defends the validity of the cinema at the level of our practical interactions, at the level of Vyavahara, he also keeps pointing out that precisely because this knowledge that we have of other people remains strictly inferential, it is only a mental construct. It's just a vikalpa that bears on samanya, a mere universal or generality of the others, but it gives us no access whatsoever to anything that would be the swabhava, the very nature of other life. And in the Santana Siddhi, Dharmakirti refrains from going as far as saying that beyond the level of Vyavahara, ultimately, other theories can no longer be said to exist. But later Buddhist idealists will do just that. In the 11th century, Ratnakirti offered a Santana Bhushana, a refutation of other cognitive theories, and because of the title, Ratnakirti is often presented in secondary literature as just taking the opposite stance of Dharmakirti. In fact, it's quite a simplistic view, because what Dharmakirti does is he carefully restricts the validity of this inference to the sphere of Vyavahara, while Ratnakirti specifies that he's only denying the validity of the inference at the level of ultimate reality, Paramatmata. And in fact, it's quite likely that Dharmakirti himself believes that ultimately there are no more others than there are selves. Because elsewhere he points out how the self and the other are just two sides of the same coin, of the same vikalpa. They are erroneous beliefs, and what's more, they're core erroneous beliefs in that they bind us to the samsara. Now, modern historians have often accused Dharmakirti of contradicting himself in the Sangha because they assume that with this inference, he was trying to prove that other theories truly exist independently of the awareness that we may have of them. But this would be a breach of the fundamental idealistic principle which Dharmakirti defends, that an object of consciousness cannot exist beyond the consciousness that grasps it. This, however, is a very old accusation, one that, for example, is very aptly formulated by Abhinav Gupta, but Abhinav Gupta is by no means the first author to mention it. And in fact, Dharmakirti himself was perfectly aware of this, because in the Sangha he has his externalist opponents formulate the following dilemma. So it's the externalist who is talking to the idealist, and he says, if your inference of other minds takes as its object the nature of other minds, then your idealism is over, because with this you've admitted that the object of your thought can exist independently of your thought. But if your inference of other minds does not take as its object the nature of other minds, then your inference can tell you nothing about other minds, and so it's not a valid means of knowledge. By the way, this is one of the difficult passages for the musicians, because I'm not sure what you can see about this, but in the upper photograph, you can see how at the end of the line, you can still read in the manuscript Vishayi, followed by a line filling Danda, and at the beginning of the next line, you can still somehow decipher Karotyatava Navi. But then it requires a lot of imagination to read the rest. But this is where additional sources come in handy. Because, for example, here we have the next word, Vishayigani, thanks to the anonymous commentary that quotes it. Anyway, Dharmakirti's answer is that actually an inference never gives us the nature of its object, contrary to perception. And yet, an inference is considered valid if it reliably helps us get what we want and avoid what we don't want. And so in the case at hand, based on your inferential assumption that there are other people, maybe tonight at dinner, you'll say something like, can I have some water, please? And you will get the water. And it is in this pragmatic sense, and in this pragmatic sense only, that the influence of other minds qualifies as a phenomena. And by the way, you can see how the Siddhananda offers a very dark view of the Vyavahara. As Dharmakirti says that we only ever infer the existence of other people because we're trying to reach our own selfish goals. The others being nothing but potential tools for us to get what we want. It doesn't mean that Dharmakirti was spectacularly selfish, but only that he saw the Vyavahara as inherently selfish. So, to conclude, as you can see, the Siddhanta Siddhi is